Hi, I'm Shelley Wood, the managing editor of TCT-MD. This is On Record, a regular program exploring hot topics in interventional cardiology and beyond. My guests are Dr. David Cohen, Dr. Sanjay Kaul. And the idea for our program today came from a conversation we had a couple weeks ago, Dr. Cohen. We were talking about how on earth you do clinical trials of diagnostic tests. Maybe you can kick things off by just filling us in. What happened? This came from something on Twitter.
So Twitter is ubiquitous. It's been very busy at this meeting, and it stimulates me to think about many things. And there was, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, there was a discussion that was stimulated on Twitter about the SCOT-HEART trial. So the SCOT-HEART trial, as most people are aware, is a test of a diagnostic of CT coronary angiography versus standard of care, most of which was stress testing done in the UK, which published a study about a year ago with 5-year follow-up, suggesting that compared to standard of care, CT angiography led to reduced rates of death or myocardial infarction, really myocardial infarction.
Right. Very controversial. It was controversial at the time. Back then, it's been controversial for 12 months. In fact, Dr. Kaul's written an editorial about it, but this most recent thing.
So the most recent thing was about somebody did a deep dive into the methods and discovered, and the methodology for this particular trial was that they didn't do special clinical follow-up. They used healthcare records and diagnostic codes to establish the endpoints.
Sure.
And they looked at the specific diagnostic codes, and there were some inconsistencies, and specifically there were some codes in there that just looked strange.
Yeah.
And that led to a bunch of a tweet storm, which eventually led to some of the investigators coming online and addressing it. Yes, and and addressing it and saying, even if we ignored these particular diagnostic codes, it didn't really, it changed the results meaningfully. But it still, opened up a bit of a can of worms and some thoughts, and certainly thoughts in my own mind about how diagnostic studies, trials of diagnostic studies would, should be done. And I think Sanjay had raised many of these questions.
Because of course he's not on Twitter, so he's missed out on this whole recent brouhaha. But you've had
if he was on Twitter, we would never get anything done. I think he said that, and I'm sure I would spend all my life just firing back at him. So
let's zero in on this diagnostic test. I mean, leave aside some of the other issues for now, at least with SCOT-HEART. But how could we learn from some of the things that you've written about with SCOT-HEART in the past and other trials? How could we study diagnostic tests, given some of the problems of following the data and open label design, all those things?
Yeah, I mean, by design, you cannot do a randomized, double-blinded study for a diagnostic test. So what you could do for these open label studies is blinded adjudication of endpoints.
Right.
Because if you do adjudication by coding, it is susceptible to ascertainment error and misclassification, which was what the whole brouhaha was all about.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two, I think it has to be a fair comparison between two diagnostic modalities. If you have the standard of care where you only have a functional stress test, and then you have the new diagnostic strategy that combines a functional plus an anatomical diagnostic strategy, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the new diagnostic strategy is going to win. And that's exactly what happened. There was improved diagnostic certainty with the CCTA arm compared to just a standardized exercise stress test. Not even the imaging stress test was only used in about 10% of cases.
Yeah.
So in that regard, PROMISE was a more credible trial design.
And it was neutral.
It was neutral, and for a variety of reasons. So SCOT-HEART exemplifies what happens when you have an unfair comparison. Yes, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You'll get improved diagnostic certainty. But more importantly, this impact on clinical outcomes was very difficult to explain.
Yeah.
And that's where the misclassification and the ascertainment error could make a huge difference.
Nobody would be dissecting this trial if the impact on hard outcomes hadn't been so profound.
Yeah, so I think that's what led people to look at it so carefully, because it was such a surprising result for the magnitude. Not that it's inconceivable that an improved diagnostic would lead to improved outcomes, but this
not on that scale.
Yeah, on that scale, it was hard to imagine.
So here's something we talked about before. Should diagnostic tests be studied in clinical trials? Should they be held to hard outcomes, such as this?
So, I mean, I think that really is the big question, the underlying question, because that's something which has not been done very much until very recently.
Right.
You know, if we look at, you know, many of the diagnostic tests we have didn't have to do anything. They simply, you know, where did stress testing come from, and what was it validated against?
It wasn't held to that standard.
Yeah, it was never held to that standard. Now, you know, we at a minimum, when we have a new diagnostic like a CT, you know, coronary CT, it is validated against the gold standard, in this case, coronary angiography, to make sure that at least it's diagnosing things
Does
correctly.
what it says it can do. Sure.
But I think, as Sanjay pointed out in our discussion just before we got here, the need for reimbursement raises the stakes.
That's what drives it.
And that's what drives it. And this has been going on in the preventive realm for a while.
Okay.
So if you look at mammography,
Right.
you know, very, you know, controversial, still actively controversial.
Yeah.
But what was the standard by which mammography was generally accepted as a screening test? Was demonstration of reduction in breast cancer mortality.
Right.
That's the gold standard.
Colonoscopy,
Or
I remember you
colonoscopy.
raised
Yeah,
it.
colonoscopy, same thing. Yeah, so those
the
kind of tests, if you're going
Trials
to be,
that big are going to be needed in cardiology to convince the gentlemen like you who really are sticklers for these types of things, or?
I mean, if we want to establish the value of them, that may be what we
Right.
have to do. And the challenge for diagnostics is diagnostics do nothing
In and of themselves.
without
Right.
actions.
Yeah.
They are only to motivate action. So we can either do these huge randomized trials,
Right.
and then sit back and wait for a long time, years and years and years, for the results, or we're going to have to do something less rigorous. What do you think?
Well, no, I think it is ironical that the reimbursement considerations have driven this trend in imaging effectiveness trials. But if you're competing against something that has been set in stone, it's the benchmark of how we practice medicine. We got to get something that offers an incremental value. And we have such good functional tests that have good sensitivities and specificities that just demonstrating that you have a small incremental advantage in those diagnostic accuracy is not going to sell it.
Yeah.
You have to show that you'd offer an incremental value to it.
But how much is it that people love their stress imaging? A lot of people make a lot of money off of doing those tests. How much is that a force in this field?
That also is a very big challenge,
Right.
because again, there's, you know, not only a history of it,
Yeah.
but there's a very large installed base of nuclear cameras
Yep.
all around the United States,
Right.
and fewer CT scans.
Whole practices built up around.
Yeah, and you know, certainly for many years, a lot of, you know, the reimbursement was so favorable for some of these things that that an entire cardiology practice could definitely survive on the background of nuclear cardiology testing.
Well, the CMS is going to tighten that up,
Yes,
and
they are.
including the PET scan, and so the cardiology community is quite nervous.
Yeah.
They're
and
gonna have to find
anxious.
something else to generate enough
Right.
enough revenue to support the practices. But it is, always. So I think, what does all this mean?
Yeah, sum it up for us.
What it means is we need to be careful consumers of this kind of information. I think that just because a test is a more accurate diagnostic doesn't mean it's what we always should do.
Okay.
Having better pictures doesn't mean that we have better outcomes. And again, this has been an issue in interventional cardiology as well. We have incredible imaging techniques that are, we have
Yes.
intravascular ultrasound, we have OCT, we have near infrared spectroscopy, and we can see things we could never see before.
Right.
But
And people love to
we
look.
need to, but we need to find out, just running an IVUS catheter up and down the artery, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Only if we act on those results in a way that's beneficial. And so that's what we have to do.
Yeah, testing does not improve outcomes. It is testing followed by appropriate and optimized treatment that improves outcomes. I think the focus should be how can we come up with algorithms where we harness the advantage of diagnostic technologies to optimize our therapies and adherence to those therapies.
Oh yes, that's a whole other can of worms. Well, thank you both for teaching me something about this today. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you for watching On Record.